On the morning of January 23, 2023, Pakistan experienced what would turn out to be one of the largest blackouts in modern history. Around 7:34 a.m., the national grid collapsed. All across the country, from the southern tip of Sindh to the mountains in the north, everything went dark. Over 220 million people were suddenly living without electricity. The power didn't flicker. It disappeared completely. In Islamabad and Rawalpindi, power came back after about 8 hours. But other cities weren't as lucky. Karachi and Lahore stayed dark for around 16 hours. And for rural areas, it was worse. Some places were without electricity for an entire day, others for 2 or even 3 full days. 72 straight hours with no power, no fans during the hot day, no heaters through the chilly night, and no working water pumps. People were stuck, and not just in homes, schools, hospitals, banks, even entire industries were paralyzed. This wasn't the first time something like this had happened. There had been a big blackout in 2021, then another one in southern Pakistan in October 2022. But this time it hit everyone. This was the second largest power outage ever recorded anywhere in the world. And unlike smaller disruptions, this blackout stretched across cities and towns, homes and hospitals, marketplaces and government buildings. The cause? At first, no one knew. Officials said something about a frequency drop, maybe a voltage spike in the southern part of the country, but that didn't explain how the entire grid collapsed like dominoes falling. The deeper story, it turned out, was much more troubling. What looked like a sudden event was really the result of a long, slow breakdown. Years of underinvestment, poor planning, and a fragile energy system finally falling apart. But in those first few hours, as cities stood silent and millions of people sat in the dark, no one was thinking about infrastructure or energy policy. They were just trying to make it through. Parents searched for candles, shopkeepers waited outside darkened stores, and children looked up at ceiling fans that wouldn't spin. Hospitals scrambled to keep patients alive. And across the country, people asked the same thing: how could this happen? What they didn't know yet was that this blackout wasn't just a one-time disaster. It was a warning. A glimpse of just how close everything was to falling apart. And in the coming hours and days, the full impact would unfold, bringing the country's weak points into sharp focus. As the hours passed, what had begun as a strange inconvenience quickly turned to a national emergency. Pakistan's largest cities, normally full of life and noise, came to a standstill. Karachi, a city of over 20 million people, had its streets choked with traffic, where signals had stopped working. In Lahore, businesses shut their doors while customers waited outside, confused and frustrated. Cell phone towers failed, internet services dropped, and communication between people and even authorities became nearly impossible. Hospitals were hit especially hard. Generators kicked in where they were available, but fuel supplies were limited. In some hospitals, life-saving equipment had to be rationed. Emergency surgeries were delayed. Staff worked in dimly lit rooms, relying on flashlights and battery-powered devices. Patients in intensive care units, dependent on ventilators or dialysis machines, were suddenly at risk. In smaller clinics and rural hospitals, backup power didn't exist at all. Water, often taken for granted, became a major problem. Electric pumps stopped working, leaving entire neighborhoods without clean running water. In homes and apartment buildings, taps went dry. People walked for blocks in search of bottled water or working hand pumps. In areas where winter temperatures were low, the lack of electric heaters added another layer of misery, especially for children and the elderly. The manufacturing sector, already struggling from economic pressure, took a major hit. Factories across Punjab and Sindh shut down entirely. Textile mills, one of the country's largest exporters, stopped operations. In some cases, workers were sent home for days. Cold storage facilities lost temperature control, risking millions of rupees worth of food and medicine. Small businesses with no access to generators closed shop, losing vital income in an already strained economy. Banks could not process transactions. ATMs were down. Point-of-sale machines stopped working in stores. In parts of the country, even fuel stations could not operate, leaving people stranded without the ability to travel. Urban infrastructure that depended on automation, such as metro rail systems and toll plazas, went offline. City governments were left scrambling to manage traffic by hand, redirect resources, and calm growing public concern. For many citizens, the blackout wasn't just about lights being off, it was about being cut off from the rest of the world. With phones dying and internet access gone, Families couldn't check on loved ones, offices couldn't contact employees, businesses couldn't reach suppliers or clients. It was a breakdown of trust in a system people had come to rely on, even if it was flawed. Still, many tried to adapt. In neighborhoods, people lit candles and gathered in groups to share food and updates. Some radio stations remained on air using emergency generators, becoming the only source of information for millions. Social media, accessed briefly by those with backup power or mobile data, became flooded with confusion, complaints, and questions no one could yet answer. And as night fell across the country, the darkness became even more unsettling. What was usually a glittering view of city lights from rooftops or highways had turned pitch black. Only a few scattered buildings glowed, hotels or offices with powerful private generators. The rest of the country sat under a dark sky, quiet and uncertain. In that moment, Pakistan was not just experiencing a power outage. It was witnessing what happens when an entire infrastructure collapses all at once. How closely daily life depends on systems that, when broken, bring everything to a halt. While citizens across Pakistan were struggling through the chaos, behind the scenes, engineers and officials were working to trace the origin of the massive failure. The country's fragile power grid had experienced blackouts before, some lasting hours, others stretching into days, but this one was different. It affected nearly every province at the same time. Something had triggered a nationwide failure, and the government needed answers fast. The Ministry of Energy soon confirmed that the blackout was not caused by a terrorist attack or foreign cyber intrusion, though those fears had initially surfaced online. Instead, the cause was internal, rooted in the country's outdated and mismanaged power infrastructure. Officials pointed to a voltage fluctuation that occurred during maintenance work on the southern transmission lines. That fluctuation rapidly spread, tripping multiple power plants across the country in a domino effect. Pakistan's power grid is a delicate network, divided into regions, but connected enough that a disturbance in one part can ripple through others if not managed quickly. At the center of the issue was the synchronization between the north and south transmission systems. These two sections must be carefully balanced, but during routine maintenance early in the morning, a technician's action unintentionally caused a surge that the system couldn't contain. Within seconds, major power plants in Sindh and Balochistan disconnected automatically to prevent damage. The failure moved northward. Hydroelectric plants, coal stations, and gas-fired units all began to shut down as a safety measure. What made this failure worse was that Pakistan operates with a very narrow margin between electricity demand and production. On a typical day, the grid is already under stress. When large stations suddenly go offline, there is little backup power to stabilize the system. Instead of localized blackouts, the entire country plunged into darkness because the system lacked the automation and advanced controls needed to isolate and contain the disturbance. In technical terms, the grid had collapsed. That means the generation fell below the level needed to maintain frequency, a measure of electrical balance across the network. When that happens, the grid must be restarted almost from zero, a difficult and time-consuming task in any country, but especially in one where equipment is outdated and manually operated. Pakistan's aging infrastructure was part of the reason the collapse was so complete. Many power stations are more than 30 years old. Some still rely on analog controls. In wealthier nations, software and remote sensors allow grids to respond in milliseconds. But in Pakistan, operators often have to rely on manual processes, delayed data, and a lack of coordination between regional power centers. Another problem was the shortage of black start capacity. These are special power stations that can restart the grid without relying on external electricity. Pakistan has very few of these, and even fewer that are kept in working order. When the blackout occurred, restarting the grid required physical inspection and gradual reconnection, plant by plant, city by city. Despite the overwhelming scale of the crisis, some engineers remained at their stations for over 24 hours without rest. In freezing temperatures and with little communication between sites, they began the slow work of bringing the system back online. First, the power plants had to stabilize their generators. Then transmission lines had to be tested for faults. Only after that could electricity be sent to urban centers. The technical cause was now clear. A poorly managed voltage change in one region had pushed the entire system beyond its limits. But beneath that was a deeper truth. The blackout was a warning. A signal that the country's aging energy system, already strained by underinvestment and rising demand, was not equipped to withstand even a minor misstep. As sunrise lit up the cities and villages of Pakistan on that January morning, millions of people awoke still without power. The blackout had lasted through the night, leaving families to sleep without heaters and food vendors to open their stalls without refrigeration or electricity. But in control rooms and power stations across the country, engineers had worked through the darkness, restarting generation units and testing connections one section at a time. Restoring power to an entire nation is not as simple as flipping a switch. The process, known as a grid restoration or system recovery, must be done in stages. After the frequency collapse, generation units had to be brought online one by one. Load balancing, the act of matching power supply with demand, became a difficult puzzle, especially in regions with unpredictable energy needs. Some of the first areas to regain electricity were parts of Islamabad and Lahore. These cities had higher priority grids connected to key government institutions and military facilities. Power was gradually restored to essential infrastructure like hospitals, water treatment plants, and airports, but rural areas and smaller towns were left in the dark for much longer. By the afternoon of January 24th, limited power had returned to most major cities, but even then it was not consistent. Voltage fluctuations continued, lights would come on for an hour and go out again. In Karachi, some districts had partial electricity by midday, while others remained without power until the next morning. People began lining up at gas stations again, not for fuel, but to charge mobile phones and refill cooking gas canisters. Pakistan's telecommunications sector, already stretched thin, now had to deal with damaged networks and overloaded systems. Some mobile towers had been running on backup batteries for nearly a full day. Once those batteries died, entire areas lost cellular service. Landlines were mostly unusable. Internet service providers, especially in smaller towns, were unable to restart operations until electricity was fully restored. Economic losses were mounting by the hour. Markets stayed closed and industrial zones remained silent. Textile factories in Islamabad, many of which operate on tight export deadlines, reported missing an entire production day. Small businesses, particularly those without generators, suffered the most. In a country where many people live hand to mouth, even a single missed day of work could mean going hungry. Water shortages began to emerge in cities like Rawalpindi and Peshawar. Water pumping stations require continuous electricity, and with no power, reserves began to run out. Municipal workers had to set up emergency delivery systems using trucks, but those could only reach a limited number of neighborhoods. In several areas, people walked miles to collect water from open wells or streams, unsure of its safety. The blackout also raised questions about emergency preparedness. Few hospitals had functioning generators for extended use. Schools closed for an extra day in multiple provinces due to unsafe conditions and lack of communication. Some areas had no working traffic signals for over 24 hours, leading to dangerous intersections and multiple road accidents. By the end of the second day, power had been restored to most of the country, but full stability would take longer. The grid remained vulnerable. Officials warned citizens of potential rolling blackouts in the following days as engineers continued to monitor the network and carry out inspections. Across Pakistan, frustration mixed with fear. This was not the first blackout, but it was by far the largest in recent memory. People demanded answers, accountability, and assurances that such a disaster would not happen again. The physical power may have returned, but trust in the system had been severely shaken. In the weeks that followed the massive blackout of January 23rd, the government of Pakistan launched a formal investigation to determine exactly what had gone wrong. The Ministry of Energy held press conferences and issued updates, but clear answers were slow to come. Officials pointed to a voltage drop that triggered a shutdown, but the underlying causes ran deeper than just a sudden frequency collapse. Investigators from the National Transmission and Dispatch Company began piecing together a complex picture. Their early findings suggested that maintenance protocols had been overlooked and that several key power stations had failed to respond correctly when the voltage levels dropped. In simple terms, the safety systems that should have isolated the problem and contained it did not function as expected. Further scrutiny revealed weaknesses in the grid's design, including the lack of regional isolation zones. In many modern systems, a failure in one area can be cut off to prevent it from cascading. But in Pakistan's case, the interconnected grid meant that once one segment collapsed, the rest followed like falling dominoes. Energy experts warned that unless the infrastructure was upgraded and monitoring technology improved, similar incidents could occur again. There were also calls for accountability. lawmakers questioned whether power station operators had been properly trained and whether budget cuts had led to the neglect of crucial upgrades. In Parliament, opposition leaders demanded an independent audit, arguing that Pakistan's energy security was too important to leave in the hands of bureaucracy alone. Meanwhile, citizens tried to move on from what had been one of the most disruptive blackouts in the country's history. For millions, it had not just been about darkness, but about the loss of dignity in daily life. Elderly people had gone without medical equipment, children had been left cold during winter nights, families had missed meals because electric stoves and gas pumps were useless, trust in public services had taken a serious hit. In the aftermath, there was renewed interest in off-grid solutions. Some households turned to solar panels, even on a small scale, as a form of insurance against future outages. Businesses began investing in higher capacity backup systems. But for the poor who could barely afford basic electricity to begin with, there were few options. International observers also weighed in. Energy experts from neighboring countries and global organizations offered technical support and analysis. Several reports compared Pakistan's crisis to similar blackouts that had affected large countries in the past, noting that poor grid maintenance and centralized systems were common risk factors. The lessons were clear: without modernization, the risk of collapse would always be present. By February, stability had returned, but the memory of that dark January night still lingered. Social media continued to carry stories from across the country. Images of candlelit classrooms, makeshift emergency rooms, and frustrated workers trying to continue life in the absence of light. These personal accounts served as reminders of how vulnerable life had become in the absence of reliable infrastructure. The Great Blackout of January 23, 2023 was more than a power failure. It was a national reckoning. It revealed the cracks in a fragile system, exposed the limits of outdated technology, and reminded millions of what happens when progress outpaces planning. As Pakistan moves forward, the true challenge will not be just keeping the lights on, but ensuring that the entire country is never left in the dark again.